The act of killing depicts the creation of a false narrative surrounding communists in Indonesia and the harm it has had on the country's powerless. A narrative where the powerful are heroes, while the powerless are silenced or are killed. In the film, the powerful are government and military officials, media leaders, and gangsters, like executioners such as Anwar and Herman, all of which have a somewhat symbiotic relationship. Throughout the film, for example, elected officials like Indonesia's vice president can be seen proudly giving speeches on the importance of gangs in the country, serving to legitimize gang power and violence. In effect, validating the fear gangs create in civilians and the terror that supposed communists live under. Meanwhile, media leaders bolster anti communist rhetoric, confirming government propaganda and gang messaging. They play a large part in incentivizing the public to believe false narratives, the communist killings themselves, and the continuation of fear among civilians. In return, gangs would provide the media with protection while helping extinguish public opposition for government officials by eliminating vehicles for change, like protests. This leaves civilians and supposed communists as the powerless. Because the film targets the train of thought and actions of participants in the genocide, there's little intel provided about citizens and victims from their own perspective. This lack of information serves as an example of the silence forced upon civilians, both via government, media, and gang enforcement. With violent anti communist propaganda being fed to civilians as early as elementary school, if not prior, and a lack of protestation available to residents, the film creates an inquiry on the intellectual freedom of citizens, questioning whether their oppression goes as far to rip them from originality and imagination. When anti communist sentiments are fed to you in almost every aspect of life, are anti communist victims as well, or simply perpetrators? These power relations culminate to a series of normalized sadistic actions upon the powerless. Communists are killed and extortioned, civilians are silenced and manipulated, and although not covered in length, women are but mere entertainment. Ultimately, as stated by an anonymous co director, the act of killing depicts the true legacy of the dictatorship, that being the erasure of the ability to imagine anything but.
Using gender to analyze the film led me to understand the role of women in illustrating the nature of the military dictatorship through its abuse and violence. It wasn't in a rhetorical sense when the gangsters repeatedly claimed, "Gangsters are free men." There are no women in sight throughout the film to occupy positions of power within the organization. They solely occupy the backdrop of the men's rule as mothers, girlfriends, and children. While it isn't new for women to be excluded from the political scene, their absence as respected characters is coupled by rampant and explicit demonstrations of sexual harassment and objectification throughout the film. We saw perhaps the most telling look into how this treatment of young women was accepted and treated as norm here.
Itu kamu pasti ada tai lalat di sini. Di sini pasti ada tai lalat. Pasti ada.
The girl's reaction of an awkward laugh and composed demeanor demonstrates how power relations in the country are embedded to maintain the social and political hierarchy. Other instances of normalized sexual violence were made clear in the rape of young girls and their utter lack of personhood. Its pervasive presence as a tool of oppression for the quote-unquote communists decorated the core narrative of the film as one pertaining to the immeasurable trauma endured at the hands of the military leaders, as well as reinforced how we saw governing institutions, like an organization of gangsters, work to shape political and gendered hierarchies. The Dutch researcher Saskia Wieringa discussed these themes of sexualized violence along with the demonization of communist women, such as in the portrayal of the character Amina, the supposedly mad communist woman played by Anwar's sidekick. She explains that misogynist treatment and depictions of women in these ways are not included coincidentally or to provide humor. They are fundamental to understanding the widespread nature of sexual violence in the film.
Now, let's look at the editing choices in the act of killing, with a specific focus on scene transitions and the usage of juxtaposition. In this film, the producers are dealing with heavy topics and discussions, and so, to lighten the overall mood and better the enjoyment of the film, we will often find a heavy scene cut immediately to a heartwarming scene that is typically comical or that is so jarringly different from the subject matter that it pulls the viewer out of the intense scene. This was intended to portray these gangsters, who have murdered, scammed, threatened, and tortured, and are generally regarded as villains to be more human, providing them with necessary dimensions to their character portrayals and a holistic comprehension to the history of Indonesia. Another layer to this stylistic choice can be attributed to purposefully confuse or surprise the audience, to keep them engaged and perceptive. We especially see this with the primary character, Anwar Congo, who is seen grappling with his past issues and attempting to resolve them in his present. In this specific scene, we see Congo reluctant to apologize to the families that he essentially ruined, but is then depicted as encouraging his sons to immediately apologize for injuring a duck. It is important to note that we can only see this scene in the director's cut, not in the theatrical cut. Another intention of this abrupt cutting style can be found in particularly heavy scenes. Immediately after Anwar Congo comes to terms with how his victims felt humiliated and degraded through torture, we see how Adi Zulkadri and how Herman Koto coped with the emotional consequences of their actions. One is peaceful, the other joltingly loud. One serious and the other almost comical. This was intended to not only disorient the viewers, but to once again represent the dimensions to these killers. By looking at the cutting choices of the film and producers, we are better equipped to understand the content and purpose of the film.
Throughout the act of killing, the audience is exposed to the intricate layers of each interviewee. While the documentary primarily follows former gangsters responsible for ruthless politicides between 1965 and 1966, Joshua Oppenheimer skillfully unveils their complexities by capturing the narratives they construct. As we can recall from Patterson and Monroe's 1998 paper, Narrative in Political Science, narrative also refers to the ways in which we construct disparate facts in our own worlds and weave them together cognitively in order to make sense of our reality. Adi Zulkadri, a former executioner, exemplifies this narrative construction, forming a storyline that sidesteps the complexities of his past actions. In Zulkadri's narrative, his participation in the killings are portrayed as a virtuous and necessary act. He justifies not only the Indonesian politicides, but also draws parallels to other political controversies such as Bush's involvement in Guantanamo. Zulkadri constructs his reality by interpreting his situation through the lens of the past, avoiding a critical reflection of his past involvement in terms of the present and neglecting to incorporate nuances that may challenge his established reality. Anwar Congo serves as a contrast. He does not fashion a comforting story for himself. He has not fully made sense of his involvement, and when he does, he shows regretfulness, allowing for layers of complexity to permeate his narrative. Consequently, Congo remains haunted by the memories of his actions. As Patterson and Monroe state, we never stop telling ourselves stories because it is how we make sense of our place in the world. This encapsulates the essence of the documentary, where the interviewees' self-constructed narratives serve as a means to comprehend their roles in these events of history.
When hearing about the cruel actions of people like Anwar Congo, we often ask ourselves the same question. How do they sleep at night? Are they not haunted by what they did? The act of killing lets us explore Anwar's psyche and how he struggles and reconciles with the atrocities he committed. Anwar often expresses his struggles with the invocation of the spiritual and supernatural world. Anwar constantly talks of ghosts whom he created and which now haunt him. Ghosts for Anwar are ever present, but manifest themselves most when Anwar is alone, with no yes men or accomplices around. The ghosts become more powerful. Throughout the film, Anwar characterizes ghosts not simply as people who have passed on, but as his victims who did not want to die. He's told to deal with his emotions in different ways, from his mother's emphasis on proper prayer before bed to seeking professional help.
Mama saya yang duluan dangan. Dia yang duluan. Dia bangun nih saya. Itu, makanya kalau mau tidur cuci kaki, berdoa yang bagus-bagus, jangan terus tidur. Begitu dia bilang.
Anwar does not seem to take anyone's advice and allows himself to continue to be haunted. But what do ghosts mean for someone like Anwar? Ghost represents Anwar's PTSD. The act of killing allows us to explore the massacres and tortures through the eyes of the perpetrator. Lots is known on the subject of PTSD among survivors and victimized witness of torture. However, not much research is done on the effects of PTSD on the torturer. The act of killing complicates the black and white image of the torturer as someone who's purely apathetic. Can torture be viewed as a double-edged sword? An act that impacts both parties, but one with lethal consequences for the victims? Anwar reflects on the fear he felt being in the same position as his victims. He says he can feel their pain and their fear, yet in a rare moment for the film, the director intervenes and reminds Anwar that he was the perpetrator and will never feel the fear and terror his victims did, reminding the audience that this is not a redeeming film about Anwar, but one that simply complicates him.
Jelas, apa yang dirasakan orang yang disiksa Bang Noir jauh lebih buruk dari ini karena Bang Noir tahu ini hanya film. Mereka tahu bahwa mereka akan dibunuh.
In the final scenes of the film, Anwar's confrontations with his ghost invoke in the audience strong emotions. Not necessarily a sympathy for Anwar, but a deep grief, remorse, and frustration that his realization came all too late to prevent all the pain he had inflicted for decades.